First of all, this session is Why Should Teachers Read Children's Lit? With busy working life, teachers are often not exposed to the wealth of children's literature available and so often fall back on books from their own childhoods. Join a session to explore the myriad children's books available and how they can be used to create interactive and enjoyable reading sessions in your classroom. Our speakers today are Mary Rose Grieve, Nikki Gamble, and Alice Bitter.
Okay, lovely.
Thank you. Hello, good morning, everybody. We're just going to introduce ourselves a little bit more so you know a bit about us. So I'm going to hand over to Nikki, who is the star of the show, I think.
Oh, no, don't be... what an impressive room. It's like being in the United Nations, being in here, isn't it? So I'm Nikki Gamble. I'm from the UK. My background is in teaching, both secondary and primary. And then for a large proportion of my career, I worked in teacher education in a variety of universities, starting with Anglia Ruskin University, then the University of Cambridge, the Faculty of Education, and UCL in London. My work within those universities was always focused on literacy and English teaching, and I ran a master's course in children's literature as well. I suppose I've been independent for the past almost 20 years, running Just Imagine, which really hasn't got a description of what it is. It does whatever it feels like at whatever time it feels like doing it, but it's always around engagement with children's books and reading.
Good morning. My name is Mary Rose Grieve. I have been the librarian at Heartland International since 2015, just after the school opened. I was the School Librarian of the Year in 2019, and I now am the co-chair of the Great School Libraries campaign in the UK. And I have a special interest. I've learnt so much from Nikki, and she and I have worked together at various times with her summer school and various other things. So I've learnt an awful lot from her about children's literature. But I also run the OU UKLA Teachers Reading Group in Dubai, which I've been running for the last 6 years, which is based around exploring research around reading for pleasure and teachers doing some action research in their classrooms. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is about why teachers need to know about children's literature from a reading for pleasure perspective. So that those are my particular interests. And I have the privilege of working with Alice, who I'm going to hand over to now.
Oh, it's a real star.
I'm Alice Bitter. I'm a teacher at Heartland International School alongside Mary Rose, and have been a class teacher for 6 years. I am part of Mary Rose's Reading for Pleasure UKLA group and have done that for the past 2 years, and basically try out all of the wonderful things that she teaches us about to actually try them in the classroom and see how it works with the children that we have in front of us at Heartland, and try to spread reading for pleasure with our children in as many ways as possible through both Nikki and Mary Rose's teachings.
Did we want to take some very quick feedback? We asked you deliberately when you came into the room whether there was a book that you connected with. So the books that we put out were selected for their recognisability, weren't they? That's not a real word, but I made it up. And we'd quite like to take some feedback on whether there was something that evoked an emotional response for you in those books. Did anybody go for it?
I picked up the migrants just because we're about to teach about Vikings and why humans migrate, and also it's quite striking with the illustrations. It was eye-catching, so I picked up, and it's actually a word that I haven't seen it before, but it's very powerful. I almost had me in tears. It's very powerful.
So that was about you making an instant connection with the book rather than it being something that you recognised from your own childhood. And we thought we would get both of those responses, actually, didn't we? Did anybody see anything that they did recognise from having read themselves? I'm so sorry we didn't bring Dr. Seuss. That is for any American audience, not to bring that or Margaret Wise Brown is such a problem. Anyway.
Yes.
I read it to my son, and I read it when I was my son's age.
And did your son enjoy it as much as you did? Do you think? Did you find that he had the same response to it as you did when you read it as a child?
The second time I read it to him, I enjoyed it more. At first, I was doing, of course, I read aloud to him. And at first he was not happy because it's hard and stuff. But as the time goes, and as I stuck to reading the book, and I talked to him, and we thought about the book, then he...
What I would like to know is when you saw that book, can you describe the emotion that you had when you saw that book?
Well, I thought of me being a kid and holding the book and reading it, and all the emotions that I had when I was reading about the rat and what was happening, and the characters who now I see them as human beings, where back then I only saw them as animals. And so that just sparked in me the joy of reading.
So what you've said there is actually really quite profound, and you've said all the points that we want to raise in the next 45 minutes. One is about the emotional connection. I'm going to leap straight into it, even though we weren't going to come to it until a little bit later, is that reading these books from our own childhood, rereading them, is a portal into that childhood experience. It does remind us what it was like to be a child. And a little while ago, I interviewed Lucy Strange. You might know Lucy Strange. Her latest book is called The Island at the Edge of Night. And she says when she writes a book, she always goes after a particular feeling. That's one of the things that she's trying to do. She says, because when we grow up, the chances are we forget most of the plot. I've forgotten it 10 minutes after I've read it, the plot, to be honest. Increasingly, I find it really hard to remember, what did I read yesterday? We forget the plot, but we never forget how it made us feel when we read it. And so I think that's starting with the emotion. We're immediately back in to our childhoods. And that's quite a precious thing when you're sharing reading with children in your classes and your own children, because you're not only sharing the book, you are sharing a part of yourself that has been where they are, but also at the same time, you're gaining a different sense of that book. It's very complicated and it's very profound. And you said it all, and we can go and have coffee now.
I think that it's interesting that the affective response that you have to reading children's books, particularly, and rereading them. And therefore, I mean, this question is, why should teachers read children's literature? But I think we need to start with, why should adults read children's literature? Because understanding that what we're doing with our own children is reaccessing or allowing them to build those emotions that allows them in 20, 30 years' time to also have those feelings. And I don't know if any of you have read this tiny little essay. Catherine Randall, who writes wonderful children's books, wrote this book, Why You Should Read Children's Books, Even Though You're So Old and Wise. I think I must have bought 20 copies of this and hurled it to anybody who looks like they look askance when you say, oh yeah, I read children's books, and they go, ooh, but you're a bit weird. Well, you're a grown-up, you shouldn't do that. This explains in lots of quite interesting ways, and some ways that I think, Nikki, you find more problematic, about why it is that adults should read children's literature. And I mean, it's quite a good way to start, I think, exploring it through what she says. And one of the things I always remember she says is, you would never ask someone to teach your child to play the tuba if they couldn't play the tuba themselves. And it, you know, I mean, I know we're talking about adults, but actually it is, as a teacher, if your job is to teach children to read, if you don't know the books that you're asking them to read, then you're in trouble. You have a professional obligation to know what it is that you're putting into their hands. And the question is, are you choosing books that meant something to you as a child because you already have that connection, and so you're automatically assuming that they will? Or are you going to allow children to find themselves their own books to build into them?
Well, that takes us on to, this is completely different to our plan. We're doing it in a completely different order, which is good. Let's be responsive. It takes us into, we've talked a little bit about that emotional connection, and it's good to share those books. But it's also dangerous to be driven by nostalgia. And books that we read when we were children do not necessarily translate in terms of their values to a child today, or even to society or societies today. So I think it is important not to be driven by nostalgia. And the number of times, the number of students that I've read with, that I've worked with, that don't ever move out of the comfort zone of their own childhood reading. We have to get beyond that. There's another book, actually, I don't have a copy of it with me, that I would recommend, Claire Pollard's book, Fierce Bad Rabbits. Claire Pollard is a poet and a writer. She's just written a new book called The Untameables by Claire Pollard. It is by Claire Pollard. She loved the Arthurian myths and legends when she was growing up, and she wanted to share those with her son. So she went and bought the Usborne, I think it's called Stories of King Arthur. And as she was reading it, she grew increasingly uncomfortable because she felt that it was a treatise for the ruling class. That's how she felt about it. She's quite a radical writer. And so she wrote her own version called The Untameables, which is written from the point of view of a kitchen girl and a dog boy, a boy that looks after King Arthur's dogs. It's a really, really interesting read. It's her perspective on how these knights, who are apparently noble, but actually are quite happy to go around killing other knights who happen to have different points of view to them. She's really critical of that, and she just makes you think about it in a completely new way. So nostalgia, if we just keep feeding the same things, we don't move on as a society. Fierce Bad Rabbits, it's called.
Yeah, and then and another one, that Francis Buffett book about reading childhood book. And there's a very interesting academic book by Alison Waller called Rereading Childhood Books of Poetics, where she looks at what happens as when you reread the books that you enjoyed as children, and you suddenly see all sorts of things that you now as an adult find problematic. And actually, I think it is interesting, this is absolutely not what we were going on to at all, but the idea of as an adult going, oh no, you can't read that. It's subversive, or it gives those messages, and you realise that the children aren't picking up the same things that you did at all, that you are now doing. And this idea of mediating, being the mediator through which children are discovering books, is such an important role, and one that I think we probably don't pay enough attention to, because we're so often thinking about it from our perspective. And you have to, the idea is that we're letting children find things that go way beyond our own in levels of enjoyment, or our own books that we felt something for, and they can discover books for themselves that they then build meaning from.
Yeah.
And can use in different ways, which I think we should probably start talking about about books being didactic, or how we use them as teachers in a classroom.
Can we talk about being subversive first?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
She says being subversive. Let's not go there. Let's talk about, because you used the word, so I think we should say a little bit more about that. children's books are meant to be subversive. They are the most disenfranchised part of society, if you like. You know, that they will feel, children always feel powerless because there's always somebody telling them what to do. School is one of the only places that you have to go to where you have to mix with people. You're told who you've got to be with. As adults, we always get those choices. Even in the workplace, you know, we do get those choices. So the thing about really, really great children's books is that they allow that, they give space for that subversion. If you think about the classic, Where the Wild Things Are, there's no censure of that child really for his behaviour. And it's kind of giving them, there are lots of different interpretations of that book. My interpretation of that book is that it's saying it's okay to have those feelings. It doesn't make you ultimately, in my view, the book says, there are people that really disagree, it doesn't make you a bad person to have those feelings and to have those behaviours. And of course his mother is still going to love him in spite of that. Another one would be David McKee's Not Now, Bernard, which Catherine Rundell does talk about. Yeah. I don't know how you interpret that story, but again, you know, children have always felt not listened to. We understand it from the adult's perspective. We're busy people. We can't be there at their beck and call all the time. But from the point of view of a child, it feels like nobody's taking any notice of me. And so these books are meant to validate the child's experience, I think, and be subversive. I was lucky because my dad was subversive. I had a subversive parent who bought me in 1963. I was 3 years old. Now you know how old I am. In 1963, and he bought me this book. What I didn't realise, he'd actually bought it for himself. Oops. He hadn't bought it for me. I know that because when I was 18 and left and was leaving home, going to university, and I wanted to take it with me, he wouldn't let me. So clearly, he bought it for him. And if you know the story, you will know the story really well. The other thing that children's books can do is remind us as adults that we can be playful. And as adults, it's really important that we're playful. When we got to that bit in the story where the wild rumpus starts, my dad would always have a wild rumpus with us, and we would just be wild rumpusing all around the living room or wherever it happened to be, while my mum looked on disapprovingly at the havoc and the chaos and the mess that we were creating. So two things in there. You know, my dad realised that reading children's books allowed him to continue to be playful and to be subversive.
Which takes me neatly to a lovely quote from this book. When you read children's books, you're given the space to read again as a child, to find your way back to the time when new discoveries came daily and when the world was colossal, before your imagination was trimmed and neatened as if it were an optional extra. And I think that, so, you know, we've been talking about reading children's books, both as an adult and what it allows you to do, but also then as a teacher. What relevance does this have to a teacher? And why is it so important that they tend to this path, the affective process that allows you to return to being a child again? Why is it so important?
I don't know if I was to answer that exact question, but the way that when I first thought about this question and what to speak about was that children's books and children's literature can be just as enjoyable as a teacher and as an adult as the children, the layers of it. So The Middler by Kirsty Applebaum is my favourite children's book. because there is a whole other plot and story happening for the adult that you don't have to discuss with the children, and the children don't necessarily pick up on that at all. It's a complete sort of plot about politics and the way of the world. The story is very child-centered. It's about a girl who is the middle child, and she's not listened to, and the eldest is set to do great things. The eldest has a portrait in the house. The eldest gets to go to lots of amazing things, and at school, every year the eldest wins the diary competition over the summer, and middlers never won it. And the youngest is always the baby, no matter how old they are. And the story is told from the point of view of the middler who meets a girl from outside of their town boundary, because it's when you read it to children, they think it's set in the past, because it's they don't have much electricity, they don't have any sort of modern technologies. They go down to the town square to collect their gas for their cookers. So they immediately think it's set in the past, and then it's actually set in the future, where the world has sort of gone full circle and we've become segregated again, and we have a town boundary, and if you're inside the town, you're not allowed out of the town. And these two children meet on either side of the hawthorn hedge, and it's just their story of how they meet and how they become friends. And her dad's sick, and she gets, stuff from inside the town, and the outside of the town brings stuff in for her. But nobody knows about their friendship because they're not allowed to be friends. But throughout the whole book, there is such a strong political message that as an adult and as a teacher, it's so interesting to read, because you're making all these connections to different things that are happening in the world, different things that you've experienced. But you don't have to discuss that with the children if you don't want to. But you can with certain groups that you think children will understand it, or children that you would like to broach that with. But I think it's so important to know that not all stories that we read to children are just for nostalgia, or just for because we think they're good books for children. We can also enjoy them and take 100 different messages from them ourselves. And that's the same with, it doesn't have to be as deep as politics. I chose Who Let the Gods Out because if you're interested in astrology and star signs and things, the children don't necessarily get that all of the characters are different constellations and different parts of the solar system and astrology, but you can enjoy that if that's something you enjoy and are interested in, and the children enjoy the story that's underneath it, but you can take a lot more from it as well. So
let's talk about profundity, because actually what you're saying is that they have so much more depth to them. Yeah. We're not talking about all children's books here, and there is a caveat that we'll talk about afterwards. It's not every children's book, but the great children's books have a profundity to them that speaks as much to us as it does to children. But because they are distilled, they're concentrated. Those ideas, they're like poems, A good picture book is like a poem. It's so condensed. I'll give you an example. Eric Carle, Draw Me a Star. Do you know that book? Draw Me a Star, and the artist drew a star. It was a good star. And it goes through the story. Draw me a cat, draw me a dog, draw me a flower, etc., etc. And it's quite biblical, the story. But it doesn't have to be. That's the whole point. It's not just that thing. It can be that thing. It depends who's reading it. It depends on their background knowledge and their experience. But I was reading this with a 3-year-old, 4-year-old. Draw me a star, and the artist drew a star. It was a good star. And we followed it all the way through this story. What this young child noticed was that the artist actually ages through the book. And at the end it says, and the artist hung on to the star, and together they travelled across the night sky. I shared this with some lecturers at the university, and the maths lecturer said to me, this is like all children's books, it's really banal. He wasn't reading it, this is banal. The art lecturer said to me, this is like all children's books. These illustrators can't draw. This is Eric Carle. And then I read it with a 4-year-old, and the 4-year-old afterwards looked at me. I've never seen such an intense look on a child reader. And he looked at me and said, where was I before? I thought, oh, what do you mean by that question? So I thought it meant, where do babies come from? So I started with the explanation. And he looked at me and said, I know that, but where was I before? Honestly, the emphasis on before, I think, oh gosh, it's making me cry, because I think I can't know, because that was as far as that child could explain themselves, was through that question. But I think the question was, where do we come from? Because that story had enabled them to do that in that poetic text. That's about as profound as you can be.
And you know what's amazing listening to it? You know, here we are at various points moved to tears by these things, and we're adults and we're talking about teaching children in a classroom. And if you think about the day-to-day of, I'm going to be observed, have I got a plenary, where are you going next, what's going to happen, I've got to make sure you've hit these objectives, we've got to get through this, hurry. And then you remember that what we're doing in a classroom with children is allowing them this affected, this is what it means to be a human being, this is why we're alive. And it's the books that allow us to do that, because we connect with them on a profound level. The books are the things that, when we position ourselves as a reader in a classroom with those children, and we go on that journey through story together, we're making a connection that goes way beyond a curriculum and have you passed your math test and have you made sure you put a frontative verb in a sentence. This is so deeply important. And as a teacher, you just cannot stand in a room without knowing this, because you're missing out on almost all of what it means to be a teacher, to what you have to do. I mean, I don't think,
but isn't it,
it's a highfalutin thing to say, but I don't think it's.
Isn't it shocking, though, that in a school of education, that a maths tutor and an art tutor could say that about children's books? That to me proves they are not reading children's books. They couldn't say that. They've read it on the surface, but they've not connected with that book. So I'm saying that even if English or Arabic is not your subject, the subject of reading is not your subject, we still need to be readers of children's books. I don't like the modal verb should. I keep saying to Mary Rose, I don't believe anybody should do anything, but I think they're missing out if they don't. And I think with teachers you can say should, because it's the professional obligation, but with other adults I would just say, well, you're really missing out if you don't, but I can't say should to them, because, you know.
And for your classroom, what since you've been, I mean, our teachers' reading group you do actual research projects, and Alice has done one on getting to know children's literature. And can you talk a bit about the impact that it's had on your children as you have read with them and been a reader in your class with them?
Yeah. One of the most important things from this sort of year-long process has been I survey children at the beginning, the middle, and the end, and have conversations with them every day. And the thing that kept coming up was about good recommendations. And the children that said, so I asked them to group themselves in, I don't like reading, I'm not a reader. I don't mind it, but it would be better if, and I am a reader. And actually their reasons for all of those answers were pretty much exactly the same. And the children that didn't like reading wasn't because they didn't like the act of reading. One really sadly said, I don't have the knowledge to understand books. And she would love to be a reader, but she hasn't found anything that she has understood. And others just said, I haven't found any good books. And then on the other end of the spectrum of the I am a reader children, it's part, and I said to them, you would consider it a hobby, you would consider it something you would go home and enjoy. You would make sure you pack a book for the plane because you want to read. They said, because I know about really good books, and there are authors that I love, and there are books I enjoy talking about with my friends, and it's all was about the understanding. And the children in the middle said, it would be better if there were more, if I knew about more interesting books, or I just knew where to look, I knew what excited me. So then that led me on to this question again of why teachers should read children's literature, because
we have to have the good recommendations. We can't just recommend time and time again the books that we knew from our childhood or the books that we've taught because you have to teach Charlotte's Web in year 3 for your, because you're doing farm animals as your topic, and the books that you are comfortable with because you know them and you've taught them before. You have to engage with, find and read new and current and interesting children's books so that you can recommend them. And I also asked the children, is my teacher a reading teacher and how do I know? And so I really didn't think that was going to be the answer, but so many of them said yes, because she tells us about good books. Not because, some did say, because we see her reading, or she tells us about books, or she's got a sign on her door, or all those things on the visual of how they know I like reading. But it's because they said, she told me about a book that was good, and I read it, and it was right, it was good, and I enjoyed it. And this year I've also found the power in informal book talk between children and just being able to spark those conversations and then walk away and let it be their thing, that it's not always formally assessed and it's a guided reading lesson and we have to write in our reading books and we've got to do some inference and we've got to do a summary. We have added in time for informal book talk, and actually the boys in my class, about 7 of them, were on a series of books that genuinely I think changed the environment and the culture in my classroom this year, because they were excited and all of them were different ways along the series. Some of them was on book 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we were having these conversations and saying, remember him from book 1? Yeah, you don't see him again until book 5, but remember him because he becomes really important again. And children would see each other with the next book in the series and go, that's my favorite one. You're going to love that one so much. Or actually, get through that one. That's not the best one, but make sure you read it because the 5 is really good and you have to get there. And it was so important to leave them to it as well, but spark that conversation, have the recommendations, have the knowledge of the books, and then let them discuss it. And don't then ask them to write loads about it, do something for it, just enjoy it and say, wasn't that great? Tell someone else about it. We've done this here. Make sure you tell your other friends in other classes and make sure that they find out about that too.
Perhaps one thing that I would want to say that I hope wouldn't go away is how children's books, unlike a lot of adult books, always offer hope or usually offer hope in the world, and how important that is for all of us. I was involved in a project in Slovenia after the Balkan crisis, and the libraries were a real haven during that time. And both adults and children wanted to read children's books and fairy tales because they offered hope in the world. So I think that for all of us is something that we want. Anyway, questions?
Gosh, that's gone so fast. Would anyone have any? Yeah.
I want to know what that series was that you're going to.
The Highland Falcon Thief.
Adventures on Trains.
Yeah.
It's the Adventures on Trains series by M.G. Leonard. It's just great.
It's called The Middler. I'm ready to bring in some.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Kirsty Upper, she's brilliant.
It sounds really good.
Yeah.
So
We actually separated the children in the class into, are you first, are you eldest, are you middle, are you oldest, and then ask them about, questions based on their experience, and that's really interesting to see as you want to read your children.
Any other questions or thoughts? Or I'm sorry that we could talk about this for a very long time.
and really we wanted to hear from you.
Yeah.
Reflecting as an early years teacher, because it's much easier for the older kids to have these discussions, but just taking away from what you said, I just told my friend here that next this coming week, looking at guided reading very differently, rather than having them write, okay, who is the character in the story, maybe have them have a discussion about what they like, what they learned, what will they change, just engaging with the book rather than making it a checklist of like, can you do it? But I wanted to also ask, with early readers, what are some ways that we can, because they get intimidated, it's new for them. I've seen my class, like when they started, they were, I want to read, and then there was a bit of reluctance and hesitation if they saw some friends that were better than them. But now, like all parents have said, their kids love reading. And I just think that's come over time. But any suggestions or ideas as to how to inculcate this and make it more consistent between home and school as well, like without intimidating them?
My gosh, we need a whole other session. But what I would say, and I'm going to try and keep the response brief, and maybe we could talk after. I've been involved in a research project looking at that very thing, and one of the things that came out of that was that there was not enough time for exploration before we moved too quickly to direct teaching. You have to give children time for it to distill and percolate in their own heads. Oh, that's a rubbish answer, only because I know it's such a big answer. But can we have a conversation? Yeah.
But also just knowing that we're focusing not just on the skill of reading at that stage, but the will is so important. And exactly giving them time to look and enjoy the book, and for it not to feel like work, that every time they open a book, someone's going to ask them a question. And if you think yourself about your own reading, if you knew that every time you picked up a book, someone was going to tell you that you had to fill in some questions to check your inference and to give it a rating and then to ask you afterwards, you'd be very unlikely to want to read. So, there is a really important part about just showing them that you're enjoying it for the love of it.
I was going to say it's about wordless books.
Yeah.
That's like remove the pressure of the actual reading and have wordless books, and then them telling the story, and then, yeah.
More of that.
Yeah.
So much emphasis on starting at this level and we're here to get to this level and how many cycles can read.
Per minute.
Yeah. Because I'm not going to put my we're going to get kicked out now. This is
Oh.
And thank you all so much.
Yes. Let's have conversations. Thank you.